and welcome to Sense and Sensibility, the Inflation Guy podcast. I am Michael Ashton, the Inflation Guy. I'm your host, and today on what will probably be a fairly brief podcast, I've had some long ones recently, so we figured we'd shorten this a little bit. And next week, of course, we have the CPI report. But today, we're going to talk about famous last words. The category of famous last words is always fun. When someone says famous last words, that means that they've made it's an ironic comment on what the speaker sees is an overconfident claim that's going to tempt fate. And we recently heard what might go down as famous last words from Chairman Powell. But before we get to that, a word from our sponsors. This episode of Sense and Sensibility is sponsored by Simplify ETFs, a fast-growing manager of liquid alternative ETFs. Simplify is bringing Wall Street to Main Street by providing access to institutional strategies, perfect for diversifying your equity and bond portfolios, previously only available to big institutions and the ultra-rich. Check out their website at simplify.us. That's simplify.us, and you can find their entire lineup of ETFs at simplify.us/ETFs. The podcast is also sponsored by Enduring Investments. Enduring Investments was founded to help institutions and individuals defend their money. Our unique strategies can help you if you are saving for your own retirement or for a group of retirees in Quebec. We can also help with managing and hedging supply chain cost pressures if you run a business. Visit us at enduringinvestments.com. So if you search for famous last words on the internet, you will find that people are surprisingly, so I know it as a phrase. You know, somebody says something like, man, we are going to absolutely kill the Philadelphia Eagles. And someone says, oh, famous last words. But if you search for famous last words on the internet, you actually find that people are very good at recording the last things that people say. In fact, if you search for famous last words, you don't actually get the ironic famous last words bit. You actually get people's last words. And some of them are ironic, but a lot of them are just sad. So just goes to show you, be very careful what you say when you feel like you might be expiring. And most of those things are fairly boring. But the phrase comes from the ones that turned out to be quite ironic. Famous words is a term is meant to recall the irony, if these were in fact your last words. Hey kids, watch this. A more famous and specific example of something which was an actual famous last words, but and is I think more evocative of the sense of what we're talking about, is when General John Sedgewick, who was a Union general in the U.S. Civil War, said, men dodging this, he was criticizing his troops. He said, men dodging this way for single bullets, what will you do when they open fire along the whole line? I am ashamed of you. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. And immediately after that, he was struck in the head and killed from that distance. So that's ironic. That's a famous last word. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance, and they instead hit General Sedgewick. The phrase as used today doesn't necessarily, like I say, mean the last words as much as words that tempt fate with their definitiveness. So in finance, the classic example, I should pause for a second and let you think. If you're in finance, what do you think is what am I going to say is the most famous example of a famous last word? I would say the most famous example is Irving Fisher in September 1929 saying, stock prices have reached what looks to be a permanently high plateau. Of course, about a month later, we had the crash of 29 and which began the Great Depression. And speaking of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover in October of 29, after the crash, right after the crash, said the fundamental business of the country, that is production and distribution of commodities, is on a sound and prosperous basis. See, also famous last words. Not really his last words, but pretty ironic considering we know now that we were at the beginning of a multi-decade Great Depression. The tradition of famous last words, and here we're going to get to what we're really talking about today, utterances that later turned out not to just be wrong, but hilariously wrong, is well ensconced in the Fed chairman seat. Chairman Greenspan understood this. He said a lot of things that were, interesting and crazy and silly and whatever. But if you go back and you try to find something that was just, really just a really bad call in the fairly short term, it's actually kind of hard to find. And that could be because one of the other things he said was, and he said this at a congressional testimony, "I guess I should warn you, if I turn out to be particularly clear, you've probably misunderstood what I said." Greenspan worked pretty hard to be a little bit vague whenever it came to making any kind of prediction. That didn't stop him in February of 1997 from saying, "Some bank and non-bank lenders have been expanding aggressively into the home equity loan market and so-called subprime auto lending, although recent problems in the latter may already be introducing a sense of caution." Now, see, that's ironic because we know that, a decade later we had a real problem with subprime, but it was subprime mortgages. But this was, clearly sort of the beginning. There were elements of it, but it's far enough in advance. It's kind of hard to call that famous last words. The whole notion of famous last words is that you say something and it goes hilariously wrong, like almost immediately. Unless you're Sedgewick, in which case it wasn't hilarious at all to get struck in the eye with a bullet. In 2000, Greenspan said, "I believe that the general growth in large financial institutions have occurred in the context of an underlying structure of markets in which many of the larger risks are dramatically, I should say fully, hedged." And that was in 2000. Okay. So again, it turned out to be kind of hilariously wrong, but not for like most of a decade after that did we really sort of, reap the whirlwind, as the saying goes. So again, not quite famous last words. He had a way of saying things that were hilarious, but not immediately hilarious. So they don't really go down as famous last words. More in the category of famous last words from a Fed chairman are what Ben Bernanke said in March 2007. And this is classic, and we talk about this today. "The impact on the broader economy and financial markets of the problems in the subprime market seem likely to be contained." This is in March of 2007. And, shortly after that, we started to have blow-ups of subprime mortgage portfolios, which ultimately led over the next year and a half to the global financial crisis. And Bernanke was right at the beginning of it, had no idea what was going on. And it was hilarious. And one of the reasons that was hilarious, by the way, is that at the time, there were people in the market who understood that this was a lot deeper. And so there was no reason for somebody in the chairman's seat to not know that. But it was hilarious. Yellen in June of 2017, again, this didn't immediately go wrong, said, she didn't think there'd be another financial crisis in her lifetimes, which is funny, given what subsequently occurred. But in May 2021, this is, I think, more relevant to today, said, I wish I could do a Yellen voice. This would be so great if I could do a Yellen voice. She said, "We expect somewhat higher inflation over the next several months for a variety of essentially technical reasons, but that's a transitory thing, not something that's associated with a buildup in wage pressures." So that was in May 2021. And again, hilariously and immediately wrong. And not only that, it was apparent to a lot of us at the time that it was hilariously and immediately, it was already wrong. Inflation was not transitory. It was obvious at the time it wasn't transitory, except if you were the chairman of the Fed, or in that case, she was at the Treasury. She was the former chairman of the Fed. So I'm bringing all these up, and I'm talking about Fed chairs and former Fed chairs because last week, Chairman Powell, on May 1st, in his post-FOMC meeting presser, In response to a Financial Times reporter, he said something which I think it's a candidate for famous last words. We're not going to know, of course, until something bad happens. But he said, and by the way, one of the reasons that something becomes famous last words is sometimes that it's memorable. You say something that's memorable, which is, of course, when it turns out to be wrong, you really wish you had said it in a way that wasn't memorable. And this was Greenspan's genius. He didn't say memorable things. I mean, irrational exuberance, was ironic, but it wasn't kind of exactly wrong. It was actually kind of right. And that was the ironic part, was that he said it way before, as the bubble was inflating, but it wasn't necessarily wrong. So he avoided saying things that were kind of memorable. Whereas, saying problems in the subprime market are likely to be contained just sounds like something that's going to be famous last words. Well, so Powell said, he was grousing about how, somebody, the reporter asked him about, the fact that people are talking about stagflation, and he starts complaining about, in my day, I mean, he didn't say it that way, but he was talking about, way back when, double-digit unemployment and high single-digit inflation was considered stagflation. And then he says, now he says, quote, I don't see the stag or the flation, actually. So that's really clever, right? Separates stagflation into two different pieces and treats them as words when stag is not a word in that context, and inflation is not a word. Cute, really clever. And it's going to be really, really funny if he's wrong. It's going to go down. It's going to be an epitaph. It's going to be written on his tombstone. But look, the embarrassing thing isn't being wrong. We're all wrong sometimes. The embarrassing thing is being persistently wrong and no less confident. The history of Federal Reserve forecasts, in particular during the 21st century, is terrible. Powell was also on the transitory train and used the word transitory. It isn't a feature that lots of people agree with him and Yellen. That's a bug. Everyone is wrong sometimes, but if you're wrong a lot, you should at least reduce your confidence. Now, I will say that my opinion on Powell has gone from, optimistic when he was first named because he wasn't actually an economist, to being sort of pessimistic because he seemed to sort of drink the Kool-Aid early on in his tenure, to being optimistic again when he tightened a lot more than I expected, a lot more than a lot of people expected. But now when you say something dumb like, I don't see the stag or the flation, again, my opinion on him is going back down. As the chairman of the Federal Reserve, this is how accidents happen, right? If you don't see the stag or the flation, essentially what he was saying, and what markets took him to say, is that, I'm not really worried too much about inflation running a little hot. And so I'm not, and so basically his words were read as taking tightening off the table. And in fact, the Fed at that meeting reduced the quantitative tightening, the balance sheet runoff, more than observers were expecting. And so he said something which kind of said, I'm not terribly worried about deflation, at the same time as the Fed was actively reducing their tightening, their quantitative tightening. So, but again, if you've been persistently wrong, then saying something so cavalier and being very confident that you're right enough that you want to reduce the quantitative tightening it strikes me as being cavalier, right? So it's going to be tempting. He's basically saying, well, we're willing to let inflation run a little bit hot right now to guard against a slowdown, because his forecasts and the Fed's forecasts are that housing is going to go into deflation. And so that's going to pull the numbers down. Now, of course, last year they thought that we'd be in housing deflation by the middle of this year, and that's clearly not happening. And in fact, those forecasts have been very wrong. But it doesn't really change the fact that he doesn't see deflation. Now, I don't think an ease is coming anytime soon. But as I've said a lot of times, the balance sheet part is the important part. And by reducing the runoff, the Fed is, in fact, tightening less. So Powell doesn't see the stag, and so he doesn't need to ease, and he doesn't see deflation, so he doesn't really need to tighten. But the risk is that you get an accident. And frankly, the accident isn't on the growth side. The accident here, the long-term accident would be on the inflation side. You're saying, I can cut the grass tomorrow. I can let it grow another day or two, except you let the grass grow for a day or two and it turns out to be bamboo and it grows 6 feet overnight. And it turns out you can't cut it down. You have to burn it out. And that's the risk with inflation. Inflation has stopped going down. It'll tick up and down here a little bit, especially because housing should continue to sort of, drip down a ways. But it is not showing that it is on a trajectory to get back to the Fed's target. Although they're saying it is not. And there's no sign that is happening. So inflation is only double the level that we'd kind of become accustomed to. And employment is low, but it's headed higher. So we can't call it stagflation because we need like double digits in both of them. Okay, fine. You don't see the stag, you don't see the deflation, but both of those things are moving in the wrong direction, and that's sort of the point. Inflation is too high to ease. Growth is too fragile to tighten. What's the opposite of a sweet spot? Because that's what we're in. Oh, right, a tight spot. And that's what the Fed is in, a tight spot. And that's all for today's short podcast. Hey, since I gave you some extra time, take a look at my blog post from last week called "You Cannot Inflate the Debt Away." There's a link in the show notes, and it's about the notion that people talk about that the government wants inflation because that's the way they get out of the national debt, which is in the 20-something trillion and growing by $1 trillion a year. And so what I show in this blog is that it doesn't work. There's no good way you can do that, especially given the maturity of the debt, the short maturity of most of U.S. debt. But I sort of simulate a couple of different things that could happen and just show you that you just really can't inflate your way out. And so anyone who says, "Oh, the Fed's," everyone wants the government wants the inflation to go up so they can inflate their way out of the debt, it doesn't work that way. And so that's they're not going to let inflation go up because they want that. They're going to let inflation go up because they just don't know any better and they don't see the deflation. Anyway, that's all for today's podcast. Please like the podcast on whatever platform you're on and refer others to us and subscribe. If there's a little subscribe button, you might as well go ahead and click it. I mean, you've listened to me more than once. Go ahead and click it again. Go ahead and click it and make sure that you get the notifications. You can contact me at inflationguy@enduringinvestments.com, or of course go to the Enduring Investments website and contact me that way. You can subscribe for free to the blog at inflationguy.blog, just like you can subscribe for free to the podcast. And visit Enduring Investments, as I said, if you have an inflation challenge, but most importantly, defend your money. And if inflation is coming for you, remember, you know a guy.